Hi everyone, I'm Jacob, a writer for Sacred Earth Journeys, and we're back again with another very special Journey Leader interview. This time we meet again with best-selling author of The Art of Pilgrimage, Phil Cousineau. Last time we spoke with Phil, we learned the importance of pilgrimage from both a personal growth and mythological perspective. This time, Phil guides us through the potency and transformational power of his upcoming journey, La Dolce Vita, The Sweet Life of Mythic Italy with Phil Cousineau, taking place April of 2022. We discussed his favorite components of the itinerary, what he's most excited for as a leader of this journey, as well as the potency of storytelling and long conversations that will be taking place along the way. Through the depth of both his literary knowledge and experience as a journey leader, Phil reveals why this journey is a rare opportunity to experience Italy in the best possible way, and with the depth of a pilgrim. Enjoy this talk with Phil.
Hello, Phil. It's good to be back with you again. Last time we were together, we talked about kind of just pilgrimage in general, and today we're here to talk about a very special tour you're leading with Sacred Earth Journeys called La Dolce Vita, The Sweet Life of Mythic Italy. And I just wanted to facilitate this talk to kind of just, dive into some important questions some potential participants might be wondering before they decide to sign on to this tour. But first, I'd like to start these talks with just a question about how you're doing. So that question is, where are you right now? Whether that be physically, emotionally, spiritually. Let's just set the pace this way.
Hello, everybody. Buongiorno. I'm Phil Cousineau, and I'm talking from the top of Telegraph Hill in San Francisco. And I am, like most of you, coping with the latest issues around the pandemic. I am eager to start traveling again. On some levels, I've been traveling all along because I've been reading nearly a book a day during the entire pandemic, plus writing. I finished a couple of books, about 9 different essays for other people's books, including travel books, books on mythology, and so on. So on one level, I never did stop traveling. On the other, I am eager to do something that's really at the heart of the Art of Pilgrimage book that came out 25 years ago, if you can imagine. And that's follow the impulse to see something with my own eyes. That's one of the differences. We can see a place in a music video. We can see it in a famous movie. We can see it in our mind's eye if we're reading. But the pilgrim impulse, which is one of the things I've been writing about, is the one that says, I've done enough of that, and now I have to put the soles of my shoes to the soul of the world and actually travel there to see it for myself. So I'm thank you for inviting me for another talk, because I'm gearing myself up to get back there on the road. And one of the impulses, and the secondary impulse for that then, after seeing a place with my own eyes, is having conversations with other travelers about what we're actually looking at.
Right. So this tour is to Italy, and I think you have a history with Italy. You've traveled there pretty extensively from what I remember. So what is really inspiring you as opposed to other countries you've been to lead such a journey like this to Italy in particular? What special gifts does it hold that you found there during your own travels and time there?
Well, thank you. That's a poignant way to begin this. Over the years, since actually 1984, when I led my first tour with the great poet who just passed away last week, Robert Bly, to Ireland, 1984. Since then, somewhere in the realm of 30 different tours to countries all around the globe. And many of them, in the most exuberant sense of the word, have been busy. In other words, my enthusiasm for Paris, King Arthur's England, Greece, Cuba, wherever we've gone, is so great that I want to do as much as possible. Not like your local American Express tour, but packing in a great deal of culture, music, mythological history, all of this. And after the last tour that I did with Helen Tomei, Sacred Earth Journeys, I came across the old Fellini movie, La Dolce Vita, with Marcello Mastroianni, Anita Ekberg, and some others. And while I was watching it, I realized that the entire concept was touching me in a very good place, which has to do with this worldwide phenomenon now called the slow life movement, which has to do with battling the world of accumulation, moving faster and faster, doing more, but feeling less. And ironically, ironically, Fellini's movie, which was made in 1960 in Rome, began as a kind of satire about trendy fashion and travel magazines, the accelerated pace of Italy after World War II. Remember, only 15 years after the war ended. And what he's doing in the course of the movie, over 7 days, 7 parts of that story, is he says to himself and to other characters in the movie that he wants to feast on life. He wants the best food, the most beautiful sights in Rome, the most beautiful women, all of the above. But ironically, he's doing it all for the wrong reasons. And none of it is making him happy. The more that he's deliberately trying, and this is one of the great paradoxes of life, to be happy, the more unhappy he actually is. After the movie came out and swept the Academy Awards, it actually became a phrase, a concept in Italy, but then it swept the world. The pursuit of the sweet life, La Dolce Vita, in order to slow down and kind of squeeze the grapes of life, see as much as we can, but the ancillary is to also feel it, not just to pile it on, to the point where in the end we feel torpid, numb. What have you done recently? How many 5-star restaurants did you go to in Paris? Because of this and my allegiance to things like slow reading, slow conversations, slow meals with friends, even here where I live in San Francisco, I started to piece this together, and I realized that it's been a big part of my life as a tour leader, a pilgrimage leader, a poet, a filmmaker, that the best parts of my life, as well as the best parts of my work, have been when I took a breath, slowed down, tried to focus on the moment, what the Greeks beautifully called the infinite moment. When you can go into that moment with friends, the moment's at a beautiful archaeological site somewhere in the world, and you go in and you experience it deliberately. So the more I thought about that, the more I realized I wanted to approach Helen at Sacred Earth Journeys and say, let's try a different kind of tour now. So rather than have 5 or 6 events a day, we're trying in each day of this 10 or 11-day tour, somewhere in there, we're a different aspect of Italy, but slowly, soulfully, with long conversations in the morning and at night, trying to find out essentially what I think most of us want to anyway. That's experience what we used to call, when I was growing up in Detroit, the real deal, the real thing. And if you're moving so fast in wherever you are, Machu Picchu or India, if you're moving too fast, you won't get the real thing. So that's the original inspiration for the tour there. But the background of that briefly is that I grew up, as I said, I'm pretty sure in our last interview, in a house that actually read books out loud together. Growing up in Detroit in the 50s, we read the classics. My father belonged to many different book clubs, magazine clubs, belonged to local museums in Detroit. So we read a great deal of the Greek material, but also if the viewer can just look off to the side, you can see a few of my dad's books there, Ovid's Metamorphosis, the poems of Virgil. Even when I was a kid, we grew up reading this material, and it got into me partly because of the books, and then partly because my dad developed this wonderful pedagogy, as they used to say, where we would read one of the classics and then go to a movie or go to an art exhibition. So if we read about the Roman Empire, we shortly after that, we might see a movie like Kirk Douglas as Spartacus. And I think that got into me early on as a kid, to combine the greatest reading in the world with movies, music, food, and then, drum roll, a visit to the actual place.
Yeah, it reminds me of in college, I actually took a class called Great Myths and Legends. And when we were studying Joe Campbell, we actually watched Star Wars. It is just touching on the movie about La Dolce Vita. It amazes me how much impact a film can have on a culture. And I've been hearing about, this film as I've been kind of delving deeper into like what this journey is all about. I haven't seen it yet, but that's interesting to learn that it is actually a satire. So what I've collected is there's this guy, and on the surface level of the film, The Sweet Life, is he's trying to grasp for all these experiences, but it's just leaving him emptier and emptier. And he discovers that the sweet life is actually slowing down and enjoying like the true gems of life, which even though they're not, at least in number of greater abundance, there might be less of them, but you can slow down and feel them deeper. So that's kind of what this journey, La Dolce Vita, named perhaps after the film, and now just the cultural phenomenon, is created in Italy. So it's about just slowing down and experiencing the place in a deeper way. And, people who've studied your work, they'll probably guess that this is no conventional tour to Italy. It's not just, hey, check out this site and here's a bit of history. I've had tours like that myself. But we need to look at the word mythic as well in the title. So what is really making this journey something mythic? And how does that kind of tie in with the sweet life idea?
Remember, there are two ways to look at the word myth. Yeah. One of the modern ones is that it's a pejorative. So you might say, oh, that's just a myth, in the same way that some parents, unfortunately, might say, go back to sleep, sweetheart, that's just a dream. Or don't fantasize about that. That's just a fairy tale. In other words, get on with the real life. Let's get to the facts about how life is. My reference here, but with all of my work, is going back to the sacred dimension of the word mythic, the literary dimension. Every culture has a mythic system. And myths essentially are sacred stories, the ones you hold deeply to your breast, about how things come to be. Where did America come from? How did it begin? We have several what they sometimes call the founding father stories. Those are myths, both in the pejorative sense, but also they address a longing in us to find out how something started. When you become a parent, your kids are always asking you, Daddy, where did God begin? Where did the sky come from? Where did Spot, our dog, where do dogs come from? It's both a childish, but it's also a sage question. Where did your feelings about beauty begin? Where did your love of literature begin? So all of these questions have to do with the the essential self, the essential place. In a tour like this, if I'm taking groups to, let's say, Florence, it's possible to just take a group around and go to the Uffizi Gallery and go to go to the Leaning Tower of Pisa nearby and just see the site for what it is. That would be the ordinary way of traveling. But instead, what will make it a mythic tour is that you go to Rome, you go to Florence, you go to Venice, and you can legitimately, not just figuratively, you can legitimately say, here in the Forum, in the heart of Rome, is the birthplace of the Roman Empire. This is where the whole myth of Romulus and Remus suckling the wolf, this is where this begins. And it's important because you can study what the 1,200-year-old reign of the Roman Empire, but ultimately you're going to wonder, where did it start? Where did it start? Even more exciting, we might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, so I'll just refer to it briefly because it's at the core of my work. When we go to Florence, instead of just going to so-called famous buildings, which I say in quotes, my approach there, which makes it then a mythic tour, is by saying part of Western identity is the fact that we became a humanist culture somewhere along the line. And we threw off the shackles of superstition, and not just religion, because I wouldn't knock religion that way, but the stranglehold that certain religious systems can have on us. The birthplace of this kind of thinking that ultimately you and I have to make meaning for ourselves begins in Florence. So we would go to walk in the footsteps of, and this is one of the elements of pilgrimage, when you walk in the footsteps of Emily Dickinson in Amherst, Massachusetts, or Babe Ruth going to the baseball museum, or Steve Jobs here in Silicon Valley. You're walking in the footsteps of something you deeply feel is important or even revere. That's a pilgrimage. When you follow something to the origin site. So if we go to, let's say there's a little village just outside of Florence called Ancona, Ancona. And I want to make this one of the surprises on the tour. Why would I go to this remote little village? Well, it's because there's a remote character. He should be much more well known. Syriacus, like Cy. I had a great uncle Cy who I loved. Syriacus was, they say, 12, 13 years old, walking around in his hometown where there was a magnificent arch of Trajan, Trajan, who was one of the early Roman emperors. So this was put up in his honor. And this young boy had been passing this archway on the outside of the town for all of his life. One day in his teens, he goes up and he sees the Latin inscriptions, and he's not quite old enough to read Latin yet, but he recognizes the word Trajan. Arguably, that moment, that epiphany for a teenage kid in the 1450s in Italy is what ignited the entire Renaissance. Because he then went from there and he traveled virtually for the rest of his life, all around the Mediterranean, the Aegean, Northern Africa, and doing what sometimes gets called epigraphy, when you write down the inscriptions that are carved into buildings or stones or burial ground sites. He's the father of archaeology. He's the first one who said, you know what, Jacob, it might be important to know the history of Huntington, where you live right now. Phil, it might be important to walk around and look at some of those old buildings that have the name of Jack Kerouac or Allen Ginsberg or Jack London written onto the sides of the buildings in San Francisco. Why? Because you learn how to love a place only when you know its story. So you see what I've just done there. I've conjured up a story to then, which is what I will do virtually every day of the tour, which makes my tours and pilgrimages different from everybody else's. I begin every day with a story that helps set the tone. And then I move around the room and say, what really brought you here, Jacob? Why did you want to come to Italy? In that sense, then, these stories help set the tone for a pilgrimage being a spiritually transformative journey. Not just any journey. There are some journeys that are fine if you are just looking for entertainment, if you're just looking for a suntan, if you're just looking for the best daiquiri on the planet. People travel for different reasons. Pilgrimages, tours like mine and many others that Helen offers at Sacred Earth Journeys is a search for meaning. Do you feel the difference in that? And we don't need it in every juncture of our life, but the people who have reached a crisis or a crossroad in their life, when they say, all right, I've had enough fun, if that's possible, right? I've been entertained to death, which is the function of television or pop culture. When you feel that little urge that says, I need to know if my life is adding up to something. I need to know what the meaning of my life is in context of these beautiful sites around the world. Then you're ready to travel with us.
Yeah, I'd say as per Joseph Campbell's model, sometimes that elixir you bring home is really just more insight on the direction of your life. And like you said, whether it's actually adding up to something. So we've kind of discussed and touched on more, I guess you'd call like potently spiritual or mythic components of travel as it pertains to this journey to Italy. But if travelers and potential participants read the tour description, they're going to read La Dolce Vita. They're going to read about how they get to test out all the delicacies you expect when going to Italy. So I guess this really begs the question, why is Italy kind of the ideal place to experience La Dolce Vita? And while testing these delicacies, how in a way does that bring us to the sacred, and how is that still reminiscent, and how does this add to a sense of pilgrimage, in this case in Italy?
Recently, I wrote a chapter for a National Geographic book on the sacred, which was a challenge, a real honor to do something like this. Yeah. And it allowed me the chance to go back in my own imagination, my memory, my notes, my field notes, to remember that sacred originally meant the line that is drawn in the ground by an architect who says, this is where the cathedral is going to go. You go out there with your pencil or some kind of engineering device, and you outline essentially where the cathedral or the temple or a museum is going to go. What is outside of that line that you've just scratched into the ground is what's called the profane, which literally means before the temple, profana. What's inside of that line is what's considered sacred. This is where you'll put the altar. This is where your rituals and your ceremonies will take place. What it does mentally as well as spiritually is say, let's say some of my Native American friends will say, oh, Phil, for us Indians, every place in the world is sacred, but there are some places that are a little more sacred than others. So that's where you put your longhouse. This is where you have your dance, your rituals, and so on. So for me to begin every day on these tours / pilgrimages and say, today we're going to go to Assisi. And while we're there, we're going to go to the cave, where, at least according to the legend that has been passed down for 700 years or so, this is where St. Francis put aside the trappings of him being a very rich, young, aristocratic brat, as he would have been the first to tell you, and he began the spiritual life. So his life becomes mythologized in the deep sense of the word when you ask, where does a whole life of kindness and compassion begin? See, that's a mythic question. It's not just where does somebody famous born and where did he die? So you go to that cave, you go to the basilica, one of the most beautiful basilicas in the world where he's actually buried. And now you can begin to talk about, for example, the historical question would be those birth and death dates, maybe a little bit about the conditions of Italy at the time when he was born. But the mythic question would be, why is he one of the few Christian saints who is revered by every known religion? What is it about Francis that is recognized in faiths the world over and for the last 700 years? By then, I can now trigger and invite people to come in and talk about a life of compassion, a life of kindness towards animals. That's why all the famous statues of him holding birds in his hand, that is remarked on the world over. Now, what I've done is something that traditional storytellers will often do. I saw this done once in the town square in Marrakesh by an old Bedouin storyteller who came into the town square, and he did exactly that. He drew a circle in the sand right in the middle of the town square with a small opening in it. And then he invited anybody who wanted to hear his stories inside of the circle. Once everybody had filled the circle in, then he closed off the circle. What is that doing? That's a sacred ritual that says everybody who comes in to listen to my story is now in sacred place, now is in a sacred time. So that's what I'm trying to do on these tours, with talks in the morning and talks at night, free, open-hearted talks. You begin to try to give context for some of the visits that we're making. And you begin to say, well, what do I really care about medieval saints? What do I care about the birth, let's say in Florence, when Dante decides not to write in Latin, but to write in the local Italian vernacular? That's the first time in history anybody did that, where you honor local language. And it brings something ordinary into the world that ends up being extraordinary. So what I'm trying to do, in a sense, now that I think about it, is trigger something in anybody who takes my tours, including this one to Italy next spring, to trigger a lifetime of conversations. And I'm still in touch with people who took tours with me 30 years ago, 25, 20, 15, 10, 5 years ago. Because if you allow people, here's the secret, and I'm so happy that Helen of Sacred Earth Journeys encourages me to do this, encourages participation, which not all tours do. Many of them, it's just look at the pyramids or look at that famous statue. And then people don't talk about it too often. I'm encouraging everybody in these groups to talk about their deepest loves, passions, and concerns. And these sacred sites, as they've done for thousands of years, exist to trigger those great conversations.
Yeah, and I'll personally say that I probably couldn't imagine anyone better to travel to Italy with than you, because, I could just imagine that you're just full of just a plethora of stories about each site and each city. And whereas, on other tours, like I said, you just get a bit of history and, oh, that looks nice, amongst participants. And that's, the full depth that you'll go in those kinds of things. Okay. So I have one final question for you. And I want to ask, what is exciting you most about returning to Italy and leading the tour? And as per the itinerary, are there any specific days or Yeah, just specific days, or if you can't remember specific days, just places that you're most excited to kind of visit and story tell about.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And for me, it's day 6. I did revisit the itinerary
Great.
like a good teacher and a good journalist. And it's Florence. Florence to me is the most magical of all these sites because, again, it is the origin. And this is the mythic side of me. I like to know where things begin.
Yeah.
And in a sense, where a kind of cultural miracle occasionally takes place in human history. And the fact that we can go to the house where Dante lived, where I've been a number of times, and you know that just on the beautiful polished, sandal polished flagstones in front of the house is where, according to the legend at least, Dante stepped out of his tower. It's actually a tower, and onto the street, and that's where he saw the young Beatrice. And this encounter with something often called numinous, it's when time stops. The place seizes up for you, and the whole miracle of the universe pours in. This young woman triggered the Divine Comedy. Not a bad contribution to life, right?
Yeah.
So I want this is an opportunity to take people to a famous place, but then also go around the group and say, have you ever had an equivalent of this? What's that one, the old torch song, Some Enchanted Evening, where you were at a bar, a saloon, the steps of Machu Picchu, wherever it might have been, and you felt time stop. Or you found, as James Redfield, the author, once told me, the origin of his book, The Celestine Prophecy, which sold 22 million copies a number of years ago, was there at Machu Picchu. And he said, I was just walking down to the ruins, and suddenly it was as if a kind of portal opened up. And the whole book came to me at once. And all I had to do is go back to the hotel room, and I wrote a rough draft of it there and then polished it when I went back to Birmingham, Alabama. So this one town, this happens a couple times. Leonardo has his early visions of what it would mean to have art, religion, and science all overlap. This is arguably the beginning of something very important to me that I want to pass on to the group, and that's the origin of humanism. What does it mean to bring in all these deep disciplines, as they used to say, to try to call out the mysteries of what it means to be alive, the mysteries of being human? We can also explore the mysteries of Michelangelo, but also the filmmaking community there, and something we barely touched on, the whole mythology of food. What does food mean in a place like Pompeii, where they're now discovering, just in the last few months, the first fast food joints in history? There were supposedly the equivalent of restaurants there, which mean this is where you go to restore yourself, but also fast food places. What does olive oil mean to the Italian soul? What does pasta mean? These are all, if you go into the origins of these stories and ask, as I want to by bringing in local people every day during the tour, what does this mean to you in everyday life? You begin to unpack the whole mystery of La Dolce Vita, which then, as you just cited, my old mentor and teacher, Joe Campbell, would call this the boon.
Yeah.
What is it that you learned, let's say, from this interview, or from watching a movie on TV, or a play that you went down to? If you're living in New York, Broadway is opening up again. What did you learn? What was the boon of the day when you went to see Hamilton recently? See, it's a trick that has a little Buddhist flavor to it, as well as Roman and Greek, where you quiz yourself. I think it was Cicero. Again, someone will study while we're there. We'll do just a little bit of reading from each of the the fantastic and epic-making Roman writers, where Cicero asked 2,000 years ago, as you are going to sleep each night, ask yourself, what were the 3 important things that you did today? Did you have a goal? Did you achieve it? Did you fall off the path and get lazy today? And as you're going to sleep, was this a good day? Did you fulfill your fati, your fate in life? And I think this is fun, it's clever, it's enormously practical. It's another way to think about what I challenge people in my groups to do when we have a group dinner at the end of each day, wherever we are in the world. In this case, it would be Italy. I'll go around the table and say, what was the boon for you? And again, you don't want to get precious about the language. You can play with the language. You can say, so what was the gift? Or what was the highlight? What was the high point? Did you have an epiphany? What was your epiphany for the day? This is playful. It's not fever-browed. But what it does is give permission to people. It gives permission to people to say something honestly. And over the years, the 3 decades or so now, I've had so many people tell me, no one has ever asked me that before. My husband never asked me that. My wife would never ask me that. My best friend. And then it can become a part of your life. And that's one of the, you might say, the subterranean purposes of traveling like this, so that we're not just indulging in escapism for 10 days.
Yeah.
And that's got its good points, right? We all need
balance.
a little
good balance is good.
Escapism.
Yeah.
We can use that, but I have a deeper purpose or a deeper goal in mind, which was echoed when I went to see Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese Buddhist monk, here in San Francisco years ago. And we asked him, what's your notion of pilgrimage? And he said something that's applicable here. And it's the true meaning, the true beauty isn't just being pious. It's not just checking off the box of your spiritual progress in life. It's developing the capacity to come home again and realize that your own backyard, your everyday life, is also sacred.
Yeah.
So each day we'll see something breathtakingly beautiful. We'll unpack what it means to live in our world today, which arguably had its birth in Athens and Rome in 2 different ways, but I think they're very complementary. But this is also a chance to learn certain lessons there every day in a fun way, in a sensual way, in the best sense of the word sensual, that we can bring home again. So just to play with that word for one last note on that, in my PBS show, Global Spirit, I had 2 guests. One was Pico Iyer, one of the great travel writers in the world. And then we had a Peruvian anthropologist. And I interviewed her about the tradition of the Inca pilgrimage going up the mountains in her homeland. The one most popular, one most revered of the pilgrimages is walking 80 miles uphill. This takes a while, and then they try to make it even help you earn more spiritual merit by putting a rock on your back that you take off only when you're at the top of the hill. But the point here that bridges us with Peru, with Italy, is that she says our way of pilgrimage is sensorial, which means every day you think about paying a little deeper attention to all 5 senses. So you smell, you're more conscious of smell, of taste, of touch. She went through the whole 5 senses. That is one way to think about our sensorial experience coming up in Italy. That each day, and this is very mythic, by the way, great writers. When you read Homer, when you read Virgil, when you read Dante, when you look at a Fellini movie, all 5 senses are being honored in every one of their stories. And that's one of my models for visiting Italy. We want you to pay more attention to the way you see the world, the way you taste it, the way you smell it, the way you touch it. It's a pretty good model for travel in our modern world.
Yeah, you unpacked a lot there, and thank you.
Yes.
But what that kind of left me with is this thought that perhaps pilgrimage isn't so much about how far you travel, but how much you can clear your eyes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Oh, that's wonderful. You just reminded me of one of my favorite pilgrimage quotes, although he doesn't even use the word. It's John Muir, who we know, a great preservationist, of course. He's also one of the great walkers in human history.
And he was from Scotland.
He was from Scotland. He walked after he had an eye accident in a sawmill. Yeah. And he needed, as he wrote in his own journals later, I needed to see horizons. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Yeah. He's been alone with a very, apparently a cruel father, a very tough home life in the woods of Wisconsin. He walked to California. And then from California, he walked up to Alaska. Yeah. And in the journals, he has this wonderful line where he says, each day I thought I was walking out there in the world, but then I came to realize every day I was walking in. In other words, into his own heart. Yeah. Into his own soul. Now, he doesn't use the word, but that is the pilgrim mood, where you're doing two things simultaneously. So it's not, if you're only walking or on the tour bus or on a boat or a plane and just watching, you're close to voyeurism. This is really one of the hidden metaphors in tourism. You just look, but you don't touch. And it's why people in the end really aren't happy with only being a tourist. And most people will tell you so too. I wasn't a tourist. Yeah, I went to Paris, but I wasn't a tourist. Well, it's touching to me. I'm not making fun of it. It's touching. The double aspect of it, though, is if you realize you're moving inside, which is to say, walking in the footsteps of Da Vinci sent me all the way. Imagine what a traveler would say. Allowed me to go back and revisit my love of trying to bring science and art together. He is the model for that. Dante, who's inspired by a single moment of not just knowledge, not just thinking, but love. What does he say in that book? It's the power in the universe that moves the wind, the sand, and the stars. It's love. That whole book is a reimagining of the cosmos, not just Florence, but the entire cosmos, as if it's driven by love. So on the day in Florence, that's something I will want to ask people. What's the role of love in your life? We're not talking rom-coms. Yeah. Right? We're talking about the engine of the universe itself.
Universal love,
yeah. So thank you for these great questions, Jacob. I appreciate your intention. It's a pilgrim's intention.
Yeah. And thank you, Phil, for taking the time to come back on for a second interview. And for anyone tuning in, we hope you enjoyed this conversation with Phil, and he's leading the journey La Dolce Vita, the sweet life of Mythic, Italy, to take place in 2022. What month is that, April?
Yes, it's April. And we might add that my book, which you found serendipitously down in Huntington, has just been reissued in a third edition. It's the 25th anniversary edition. I've written a new preface at the beginning of the book, mostly to honor people like you listening at home who have written me virtually thousands of letters over the last 25 years to describe how this simple book encouraged them to try to see deeper, feel a little bit deeper, and often to memorialize it, go home and write about it, or bring your photos together or all your sketches together, and then in turn, talk to friends and family about whatever deeply moved you.
Great final words for this talk. Thank you, Phil.
Travel safely, pilgrims.